There's unrest in the Winnipeg Jets fan base as a preseason comes to close, and the Winnipeg Jets don't appear to have made a lot of progress in the right direction. Let's chat about that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, we're going to be talking about, some unrest in the Jets fan base, as a lot of us are, perhaps a little bit perplexed by the so-called direction of the team and the actual results, right? There's been speculation as to, who gets sent down, and obviously the final cuts have already been made, so Lambert, Chibrikov, Salamatsin, they all got demoted along with the rest of the folks, and with that in mind, the current Jets lineup is really, it's not inspiring the kind of confidence and joy that I think a lot of people were hoping for. It's not a bad team, don't get me wrong, but if you look at what the Jets promised coming into preseason and what they've delivered, you might wonder if they were really that committed to the youth to begin with. But we'll chat about that in a little bit. Before we get started and kind of recap some of the preseason action this past weekend, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now, like I said, the Jets have just finished wrapping up their preseason against the Calgary Flames. This one was a victory. Bit of a narrow one, though, if I'm being honest. The Jets really didn't play all that well in the second half against the Flames. And sure, they did win 3-2, and it wasn't a bad game necessarily in some respects. But once Winnipeg had a lead, the Flames basically just kicked it into high gear. And, a lot of the old problems that this team has had, whether it's exiting the zone with possession, making breakout passes, doing a lot of the basic stuff that has been a problem for this team under a variety of coaches, once again reared its head in this game. And I'm not going to say that this game is entirely reflective of everything. Obviously, there's probably some changes that are likely to occur over the next few weeks. And so Arneal will need time to institute his vision for the Jets. But by the same token, I'm starting to wonder how different his vision really is compared to some of the previous coaching staffs. You look at the lineups, you look at the general approach of the team, and aside from special teams, could you really name something that feels all that different? Cole Perfetti is not playing defensive zone starts, which is pretty similar to what happened when, our Bonus was the coach. The Lowry line's playing quite a bit. Arneal doesn't really seem to be changing all that much, which there's something to be said about consistency and keeping things that worked going. You don't have to change everything if it isn't broken. But I think if you're talking about the Jets and their whole offseason of really chatting about, this idea of getting 5 to 10% better, I just haven't seen it. And when you saw them play against the Flames, Calgary kind of started skating circles around the Jets, hemming them in, sealing off the neutral zone, and just generally being a real pest all over the ice. And, certainly Hellebuyck didn't have as many tests as I think the shot clock may indicate. I mean, a lot of it was, point shots and distance shots that weren't necessarily the sort that Hellebuyck is going to worry about. But if you're playing a better team, a Colorado or a Vegas or some of these other squads that have traditionally given the Jets fits, I ask myself, what are we going to see this team do this year? And I feel like preseason really didn't answer that many questions other than, sure, the power play looks much better. And I think that is a big deal. The power play looking, sharp and generally consistent, I think is cause for celebration and praise. I think that should absolutely be, a happy point for the Jets. But if everything else really hasn't moved forward, then what really has changed? And I think that's something that is going to be, a broader topic for discussion. But in terms of this game, I mean, the Jets basically did what they usually do. You had your top line kind of get outplayed by Calgary. And then, of course, at the end of the game, Kyle Connor scores a bit of a fluky one off of the faceoff. I think Rasmus Anderson maybe misplayed a Juan faceoff. It somehow skitters right to Connor, who was very opportunistic and scored. And it was really funny because right as I had tweeted something about the top line really struggling in this game, of course he scores and gets that line in a slightly better light at the end of, I'm sure, the evening's proceedings. But on the whole, man, that top line really didn't do anything to allay my concerns about how they're going to look against actual NHLers. This Flames lineup was probably about as close to a full NHL lineup as the Jets have played over the past couple of games. And with that in mind, you would hope that the Jets top line would play like a top line, and they just didn't look that impressive. They actually made really bad turnovers. There were a lot of defensive zone scrambles and hemmed in moments. Just not really impressed with what the Jets put together from that unit. And it's the same stuff that we saw last year. So I'm not surprised. I'm not going to sit here and, say that I'm shocked by any of this. I mean, there's evidence, not ample evidence, but there is evidence that this was going to be a problem last year. And again, it's a problem this year. And of course, it comes back to the Scheifele and Connor pairing. As much as it'd be great if they really worked together, on the whole, I'm not really seeing the sorts of transition play, defensive zone work, and overall offensive game that you need from them. They might score a lucky goal here and there or some, moments of individual brilliance, but when it comes to actually dictating the terms of the game and controlling the ice and putting down your opponents, Winnipeg doesn't get that from this trio, and it's going to be a problem if Arniel doesn't fix it. I don't know what he needs to see to change his mind here, because he's got a sample size from last year. Not a big one, mind you, but if it's the same stuff that you're seeing already in camp, it probably aligns and gives you some, at least a level of expectation for what is going to happen this year. But all right, I'll stop ranting about that because you've heard me rant about it for months and months and months, maybe even years now. It's been many seasons that this has been a problem, but if we're looking for bright spots, Colin Miller continues to be, found money for the Jets. I still don't understand how he didn't play more than just a couple of games last year for the Jets. He is, quite honestly, good enough to play on our second pairing. He's scored like 3 goals this preseason, I believe, and on the whole has just looked exactly like what you expected from him, a big volume shooter, not the fleetest of foot, but generally does enough in the corners. He's not going to be like a defensive wonderkind, but he does so much elsewhere in the offensive zone and in creating, big rebound opportunities and just flat out vulcanizing the puck that you really can't complain too much. And getting him for 2 years at $1.5 million per season is just absolute baller money. I mean, you really have to be laughing to the bank with that one. Whether that means Pionk will actually see a reduced role this year is tougher to say, but I think for Miller, absolutely found money, a great pickup, and finally getting the amount of ice time he deserves. Niederreiter also scored. I think this is his 3rd goal of the preseason as well. He's looked more engaged. I like where he's attacking, near the net. He's had some great tips. I just feel like this is the Niederreiter that I thought the Jets were getting when they initially traded for him, and he's been very good for Winnipeg. Don't get me wrong, but I always felt like with Winnipeg, especially in the first year or so, he didn't quite have as many goals as I was expecting. I thought he'd be, a little more lethal around the net, especially having seen some of his work with the Islanders and Wild. I know that he is a very skilled player. His role has had to change a lot since coming to the Jets, but he is just pun intended, he's a Swiss Army knife, and I think that suits him perfectly, and I think for the Jets, he's been a match made in heaven, but if he adds a little more goal production to his season this year, that can be really helpful in getting the Jets that extra scoring boost that they frankly need from their middle six. One other guy that's probably worth talking about is Hayden Fleury, because he does appear to be anchoring the 3rd pairing right now, which, Fleury for me, he's had a bit of a mixed camp. I think he's the sort of guy that if he was a 7th defender, you wouldn't really be too upset. But I don't know if he's going to be the guy that I would turn to for the rest of the season on your 3rd pair. He just looks like the timing and stuff has been a little bit of a challenge for him at the NHL level. And, despite having an assist in yesterday's game, I got to be honest, I just don't know if he's going to really be able to carry that third pairing, especially once they start facing NHL regulars and top-end players. So a minor point of concern, I think the Jets do need to make a couple of trades here. My guess is they probably won't. Maybe they'll make a waiver claim. Wouldn't be shocking if Kyle Capobianco comes back after having been waived by the Stars. So, yeah, interesting preseason. Not one that fills me with loads of confidence yet, but maybe there's some room for growth later this season. But of course, I want to chat a little bit about the same problems because, the stuff that the Jets are doing right now is stuff that's happened before, and it does concern me that Winnipeg really hasn't learned from their previous mistakes. We'll chat about that in just a quick moment, but before we go any further, did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. NFL fans, you can kick off the start of the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Those of you who have followed through the first 4-ish weeks of action have probably been impressed with some of the best teams out there, and also a little dismayed if you're a Ravens fan and maybe you had Justin Tucker on your fantasy roster. He's missed a few too many kicks, but maybe you've been streaming the Vikings defense, and that has more than made up the difference. Regardless of who you're rooting for, FanDuel wants to give you a really cool offer. When you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and get so much more on the same page where you place your bets. And because you're a listener of this podcast, you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets guaranteed with your first $5 bet. Just go to FanDuel.com to get started. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting a little bit about some concerns that I frankly have about the Jets going forward. I've watched this preseason with a relatively patient mind, and I've tried to be open-minded about things. I've tried not to really rush to judgments about what I'm seeing. But I'm going to be honest, I'm starting to sound a few alarms on the fact that the team really isn't taking the step forward that I was expecting. And I'm not going to sit here and say that I thought Winnipeg in camp and preseason was going to look like a totally new franchise. That wouldn't be realistic, and it wouldn't be fair. But what I will say about the Jets is that I'm not quite seeing the level of growth that I was hoping for. So at even strength, the team's been okay in a lot of these preseason games. Against like the bad opponents, they've frankly dominated, which you're not surprised. I mean, you see them kind of skate circles around minor leaguers. That's cool. But once you start seeing them actually face NHL squads, they kind of look like the second half Jets last year from bonus, which is to say not great. I don't know if it's just the preseason and it's getting to the guys. Maybe they're still a little bit rusty, still kind of getting their skating legs under them. But I feel like this team looks very similar to past years, which you look at the roster, and that's not exactly a shock. I guess my question is, if the youth were supposed to be part of the movement this year, then why is a guy like Nikita Chibrikov not getting a longer look? Why is Elias Salamonson also not getting a look? I mean, if you think about the waiver eligibility and stuff, it would make sense to at least give them 10-game auditions. Salamonson, I thought, was one of the stronger defenders in camp. Chibrikov certainly looked like one of our most sprightly young players, even a little more pro-ready for the NHL than Lambert did. So why is he not earning a spot on this team? I know that there's lots of contracts, and the Jets maybe don't want to waive a couple of guys, but if this is really a meritocracy, again, we run into this problem of the Jets having a very veteran-heavy roster and not really opening spots for youth, which is, why Rutger McGroarty partly didn't want to sign here. I think his whole thing was probably, a longer-term issue with wanting to be with the Jets. But, you look at how Winnipeg has handled prospects and the pipeline to the NHL in the past, and already you're seeing a lot of the same logjams. And it's not just on the coaching staff. This is also on the front office. And I don't need them to just fire everyone into the sun or whatever, but if you actually want to be a youth movement, you're going to have to let your kids earn it. And, the handle thing I'm not going to hold against the team. That was a total fluke, a complete accident. Him having an infection from his previous surgery, totally not something the team can really control. But having a spot for Chibrikov, for players like that, your young talents, I do kind of feel like that's a little more in the purview of the team, and they had time to solve this, and they didn't. So I just feel a little mixed on all of this, and I kind of worry that the team is going to do many of the same things that it did under previous coaches, whether it was Noel, Maurice, Bonus. And it's not to say that some of these coaches didn't have really good stretches with the Jets. They absolutely did. There were times when Winnipeg was defensively elite under Bonus. There were times when Maurice had the Jets rolling all four lines and creating elite offense. But those days have come and passed. This team, as it is right now, just doesn't look all that impressive. It's not as much of a step back as I maybe am making it sound from last season's team, but you do kind of notice that some veterans have departed. Dylan is kind of a big loss. I will say bringing Miller into the fold a little more will probably compensate for some of that impact, but not all of it. And then, having the Mesnikov as your 2C, it's okay. I think it's, going to be something that's going to be noticeable when you're going against top end, top 6 units. But until something materializes and the Jets either make a trade for a 2C or one of their young players steps up enough to earn that spot, you're just going to have to sort of deal with this. But I also sort of wonder and look at, Brad Lambert's camp. And look, I will fully say that Lambert's not ready to be a 2C. I have zero qualms about that being my final line. But I also kind of said, I thought he was still NHL ready to a point. He doesn't have to play in the top 6 immediately. I don't think that idea of it being top 6 or bust is necessarily as helpful, just because, if you want to get used to NHL timing and spacing, the only way you're going to be able to do that is to actually play in the NHL. And I think Lambert showed enough astuteness in the details, especially in his defensive work and some of the turnovers he would force, his body positioning in the corners, and some of the passes and playmaking he showcased. He did enough to keep up. And that to me should have been something to the coaching staff that said, maybe if we start him off in a more sheltered bottom 6 role, you can start to ramp him up and let him grow his confidence. I feel like just sending him down to the Moose is maybe convenient because you don't have to waive somebody. But if you really want him to make the most of that offensive ceiling that he has, the sooner you can get him into the NHL and getting used to NHL reps, the better life will be. And I just don't quite understand what pathway really exists for players if you're not going to make it open for them. I'm not going to say that McGroarty was in the right about a lot of stuff, but I will say on that specific point, I do think he was more right than wrong about the Jets not necessarily having a particularly great approach to how they get their youth into the team. And I don't really want him to be proven right. I want the Jets to show that their whole commitment to the youth movement is a real thing. But so far, we're not really seeing a lot of that yet. So color me disappointed. I'm not surprised and I'm not going to be angry about it, but this is the same stuff we've been saying for years. And at some point, I just want the team to either, nut up or shut up about the youth thing. If you're really going to commit to it, then actually commit to it. If you're not planning to follow through with it, then don't talk about it. You're going to make all of these kids who think they're fighting for NHL spots really feel like they've been spurned by the team after they've probably put on a better camp than some of the veterans. It's the same thing that we talk about every season, and it's not really different here. If Hanela was the only one to make this team out of camp, I kind of think that would have been a mistake. I really do think that Chibrikov especially deserved a look. He looked ready to be on your third line and actually contribute offensively. But because the Jets haven't opened up roster spots, we're still having the same conversation years later, frankly. And that's not to say that the veterans that the Jets have aren't good. They are. A lot of them are great at what they do. But when you're talking about trying to internally improve and you're trying to create a culture of fighting to earn it, if you don't even let guys earn it after they've fought for it and proven that they do deserve a look, I just don't see what incentive they have to try for it. You won't. You're going to see guys start asking for trades again. I think that's a very extreme result, but we've seen Perfetti flirt with stuff, and displeasure with how he was being used. You've had plenty of young players in the past talk about, some of the issues. We're sitting here with a pending UFA in Ehlers, who's not happy about his usage. Maybe it's time to kind of revisit whether or not this whole approach to how the Jets have been running their roster and their lineups is really the most appropriate thing. I have, again, maintained for years that if you want to be a draft and develop team, you actually have to develop once you draft. You can't just have them languish in the minors or in juniors or wherever and never really make the league. But that continues to be the problem. The Jets are like one of the only orgs out there that seemingly does not have young players making the roster, and it's very frustrating. It's not like they never ever do it, but they don't do it enough to where it makes, in my mind, as meaningful of an impact as it could. There have been players we've had that the Jets have jettisoned that are now flourishing elsewhere, just like a Jonathan Kovacevic, who's been really good for Montreal. He's showing really well for the Devils in preseason. Could have had that on your blue line, but because we opted to keep Logan Stanley, well, you didn't. So just general frustration, but I mean, I've talked about it for so many years now to where I think at this point I've partly accepted it, but that doesn't mean that it's not still worth bringing up. And that kind of brings me to my last point tonight. What is the plan for the season? Because this team as it is like a wild card team. It might be good enough to make the playoffs, but it sure as heck ain't good enough to actually go far. Are the Jets going to make a deal? Are they going to do something with this team? Because the roster as is pretty underwhelming when you compare it against the top-end contenders, and that's the way it was last year. It was able to get by a lot better with that defensive structure that Bonus had for the first half, but once that goes away, what are you left with? And the reality is, well, kind of a rougher team. We'll chat about that in just a little bit, and hopefully I won't be too upset about the potential outcomes. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us for tonight's closing thoughts as we're just chatting about, for me, some general frustrations with the Jets recently. And, I don't want to sit here and, act like a broken record or whatever, but if we're being honest, it does kind of feel like the Jets are falling into some of their old habits. The youth are not really getting a chance to play at the start of the season. We've seen not many upgrades to the roster as a whole. The Jets coaching staff doesn't appear to be that different in nature from some of the previous staffs other than the power play and special teams. And so you're just left to wonder, what is the plan for the season? Because if you're not actually committed to the youth, then you're really going to have to lean on the vets to make the playoffs. And is that what the Jets want? Do they really want to make the playoffs? Are they trying to go for a draft pick? Because with Hellebuyck in tow, they sure as heck can't go for a lottery pick, and they really don't want to sit there and have a middle of the pack draft pick too. So what's the plan then? Because you're going to have to make this team better somehow. Whether you hope that Lambert and Chibrikov and company come in after you make some deals, and they've marinated with the Moose for a bit, or the Jets make a big trade for some other player that we haven't thought about, I just don't know. And I sit here wondering, just a couple of days before the start of the regular season, what is Winnipeg's ambition for this year? Do they want to be a developmental year? Because that, for me, would be fine. If you take a step back, but you develop your kids, you give them NHL reps, and you try and see if they're actually good enough to make the league, that's fine with me. I don't care if they struggle. I want them to at least figure it out and see if they can get to that point. If they don't even have a chance to get their feet wet, what are we doing here? I mean, this team is not at a state where it can just keep sitting in the middle of the pack every year, running it back, and ending with the same result. A first-round exit. You might get some playoff revenue, but the fan base is getting tired of this stuff. They've kind of backed off of season ticket renewals. Last year, we finally just started selling out the arena again, and now we're talking about, another season where the Jets are running it back, and there's not really been, at least publicly, or at least on the face of it, a lot that's really changed for the better. So I sit here and I wonder, how much are people going to tolerate this? Lambert would have been a really big draw for this fan base. We want to see the young talent play. We want to see them get a chance to flourish for this team. And if they struggle and really prove that they can't handle it and they are completely overwhelmed, then you have the minors options. Send them back down. It's fine, but at least give them a chance. The fact that this team is doing the same thing that it's done for years just feels like, it kind of feels like a little bit of a slap in the face, especially after Arneal spent a lot of time talking about the youth and stuff over the offseason, and we're not even seeing the best young players like Chibrikov actually get a chance to play. So it's frustrating to me because we keep doing this every year. And I guess, it's not the definition of insanity because I don't expect things to be different, but it would have been nice, if we were pitched this version of the team and this is what we're getting. I feel a little bit disappointed. And I'm not going to say that it can't change for the better. And maybe there's a plan to integrate the kids early into the season after the first couple of weeks, but I'm not getting that sense right now. I don't know what more Chibrikov is going to have to do to get a spot. What more will Lambert have to do to get a spot? Just how much are they going to have to rip the AHL to be given promotions? And I just don't know. I mean, if Lambert absolutely rips the AHL up, maybe he gets an early call up, maybe an injury forces something. But you have such a logjam at roster or at forward and stuff with the roster. I just don't understand what the plan is for the season. And I mean, I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer here, but this team isn't that great once you start digging in, to the real meat of the issues. You've got a first line that doesn't work. You've got a middle six that's good, but maybe will struggle with goal production. You've got a fourth line that's fine and actually at times pretty decent. But then you look at the defense and you realize the blue line's not in the best of shape either. Miller playing more will be a huge help, but the loss of Dylan is noticeable. Sandberg's ready to step into that role, but then, the third pairing is going to be Miller plus one of Fleury or Stanley or something until Heinola comes back. And so it's kind of especially once you realize that Pionk is probably playing second pairing minutes as well. So, for Hellebuyck, I just hope that he's ready to have a Vezina caliber season, because I think that's going to be what it takes for the Jets to actually win a lot of games this year. I think that they will be not that far off from what they were last season, but I mean, my hope was that they would be better this season, that they would be offensively more ambitious, that this team would look sharper. And I'm not really getting that sense from this team right now. I could be overreacting. It could just be me, having seen this team for years do the same thing. And maybe, some of that is kind of seeping into my perhaps doomery takes here, but I am not loving the look of this team this season. And the preseason stuff that we've seen, aside from the power play, really isn't inspiring loads of confidence. I do think a functional power play goes a lot to resolving some of the goal differential issues that the Jets have had offensively. But if your power play is the thing that you're leaning on to be your special carrier, I don't know. The power play is less helpful sometimes once you reach the postseason. So for the Jets, all I hope is that they find a way to start integrating that youth and getting this roster back up to health. Because if not, then at least get ambitious on the trade market and try and find a way to improve this team significantly. Because as it is right now, the league is, probably not that impressed with what Winnipeg has put forth. And as a Jets fan, I'm not really feeling it either. But maybe there's still time to solve something. Maybe we'll see something special. I mean, the nice thing is you've still got plenty of young prospects who look like they're going to be meaningful NHLers. I just hope by the time they're ready, the Jets actually have a spot for them. But let me know what you felt about this preseason. Are you happy with the direction of the team? Are you frustrated? Are you thinking I'm overreacting? Drop your thoughts and comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. Thanks so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you next week with more start of the season coverage and plenty more Jets content. But as always, have a great night and go Jets go.